Secondly, who's to blame? Not just the politicians, no. The pulpits, the preachers, generally silent on the issues that are tearing our country and its moral fabric apart. No clear warnings. Now I'm not saying there is none. I know you're probably here today from churches that are actually awake, and I know there are pastors that do. I'm talking generally. No clear warnings, no directions for the sheep, no call to stand up for the babies being murdered in Craigavon Hospital or the abuse of children that's going to come. Weak, timid men in pulpits who cherry-pick the scripture in safe and preach on unchallenging things. When was the last time you heard of a preacher in Northern Ireland getting into trouble for anything? Like, come on. When? Look at the book of Acts. They got in a bit of trouble. John Bunyan, Luther, the Covenanters, the Puritans, Spurgeon, Lloyd Jones. Why don't the preachers we have today call out wicked men and name them? Like the Apostle Paul did, John Knox did. Why? Where are the pulpits of this country calling for a stand for Christian morality against RSE, psychological child abuse, abortion, sodomite marriage, hospital buffer zones, banning open-air preaching in certain areas, in case you offend someone? Offend someone? A few Saturdays ago, I took part in the Christian demonstration that walked down to Craigavon Hospital when the buffer zone was put in. You know, they've already murdered 1,000 babies in Craigavon Hospital. And the Christians marched down and the police stopped us at the buffer zone. There was one pastor in the crowd and not even 50 people. Huh? So this just goes on and on. And the church and the pulpits are asleep in Zion. What a shame on the pulpits of this country. They care not and they do nothing. Oh, they'll talk, but doing something. What subjects are being preached in the churches? I did this in the last conference talk, didn't I? I looked up again this week some of the big churches in Northern Ireland. What's the latest subjects? Bearing in mind what's going on in our nation, what's the subjects? Quote, the purity of Scripture. Now, I'm not against these subjects, by the way. There is a purity of Scripture. That's not wrong. The purity of Scripture. A prosperous soul. God's river still flows. The enemies of the cross. Going up to heaven. Gospel messages or lessons from the cave of Adullam. An evening of praise and lessons from shoes. A 1,000 babies murdered in our local NHS hospital. State-sponsored child abuse coming right on in. Buffer zones at hospitals. We're hearing lessons from shoes. I don't think that's going to cut it, mate. You know, lessons from shoes. You know the state that England was in before the revival? I'm going to give you a wee quote. It's from J.C. Ryle, sorry. I'm not going to read it all, but listen to this. England before the Great Awakening. Corruption. Now think about today in our government, okay? Corruption, mismanagement in high places was the rule. Purity was the exception. Rotten boroughs flourished. Bribery among all classes was open and unblushing and profuse. The state of the country, in a religious and moral point of view, was so painfully unsatisfactory that it's difficult to convey an adequate idea of it. Darkness, he says, prevailed. Christianity seemed to lie as one dead, insomuch that you might have said it is dead. Morality, however, was much exalted in the pulpits, was thoroughly trampled in the streets. There was darkness in the high places, in the low places, darkness in the court, in the camp, in the parliament, in the bar, that's at the judgment bar, darkness in the country, darkness in the town, darkness among the rich and the poor, thick, gross moral darkness that could be felt. Does anyone ask what the churches were doing then? The answer is soon given. The Church of England still existed in those days, with her admirable articles, her time-honoured liturgy, and her 10,000 clergy. The nonconformist churches existed. It's hardly one liberty and its free pulpit. But one account unhappily may be made of both. They did nothing. They were sound asleep. This is what church history says. The churches did nothing. They were sound asleep. Sermons everywhere were little better than miserable moral essays. You ever heard them? Essays. Both parties seem to agree on one point. Leave the devil alone. Do nothing for the souls and hearts of men. When such a state of thing exists in the churches, he says, it can surprise no one to learn that the land was deluged with infinite sin and skepticism. See? End of quote. That's before the revival under Whitefield and Wesley. The churches, it's recorded, were doing nothing.